the intro is the hardest part. Ani Bojo, everybody. My name is Bailey Waki. I am the founder of Frayed Feathers and the host of the Frayed Feathers podcast. And miigwech for coming today. This podcast is a bit of an experiment at the moment. I'm not quite sure how edited I want to be about it, or more long form, kind of just talking stuff. But I definitely want it to be more of a natural video and thing for folks to listen to. And I think the goal with it is really to talk about all the things that surround the video that we had released the day before the podcast. And so in this case, we had released a video yesterday called what does reconciliation mean to Indigenous youth? And I want to use this long format as an opportunity to go into a little bit more detail, not only about the things that maybe didn't make it into the video, but also my experience in filming the video, gathering for the research, and then just kind of my experience as a Indigenous researcher, how this kind of plays out to this. I have a lot of personal connection to the things that we're going to be discussing on this channel, not only that we have, but will in the future. And so I feel like this will be a great opportunity to see some insights into the Frayed Feathers veil. So I'm going to break this up into a little bit of structure. So I've got 4 sections here. First we're going to talk about a little bit who the heck I am, why should you even be listening to me? I question that too. But anyway, then the second session is going to be the video, just everything about it, why I decided to go along with the videos, some high level ideas, but then also getting into the minutia of the research that we did, or that I did, and then talk about the things that didn't make it into the video. And then all this is going to be wrapped up in a final segment to talk about what exactly my goal is with Frayed Feathers and how this is going to bring reconciliation to young Indigenous people across Canada. I use the term young Indigenous people because I think when we say Indigenous youth, we tend to have a very elusive idea of what a youth is. I think in some cases a youth just means anybody who's younger than you. And then I think in other cases it's a very rigid idea. So my definition of Indigenous youth is between the ages of 12 and 30. And that's why I say young Indigenous people, because by the time somebody turns 18 or 19, whatever their idea of the coming of age to be an adult is, then they're an adult. They're no longer a youth, but they're still a young adult when it comes to programming, acknowledgements, and things like that. So that's why I use the term young Indigenous people, really just to capture youth and young adults, right? Predominantly before their 30s, but I have seen some youth programs go up to 35. And so anyway, so we're gonna jump into the first section. So who the heck am I? And I could have taken a lot of different ways to do this, but I kind of want to start from the beginning, just kind of my I don't want to say childhood, but just kind of what my experiences growing up that would lead me to the work we're doing in Frayed Feathers, right? And so I'm not gonna sugarcoat anything. It's just kind of gonna be kind of pure facts. And the reason why I say this is because I grew up in a pretty unsafe household, let's say, and had experienced housing insecurity throughout my life at different stages in different ways. And these turmoilistic, these shitty experiences led to me going down a path of substance use, and eventually I found my way out of it. And it, I was one of the lucky ones where I was able to, just find that strength in me, be supported by people at the right times, be able to hear the right things at the right time, and then ultimately kind of make the sacrifices to kind of dig my way out of that. And, the details of all those things aren't really important for the audience to know or understand, but more or less how it connected into my experiences getting into professional practice. And so personally, so I'm a dance teacher, or I used to be, and I love to dance. Like I took hip hop dancing very seriously, like since I was 4 years old. Loved Backstreet Boys growing up, Michael Jackson. I had like the One Glove and like sitting on the toy box, had the little CD radio player. And I was like, bam, you know what I mean? Like I was like all up in it. And anyway, so what happened was I got into dancing, and so blessed to have a dance studio in the place I grew up that was willing to let me teach at 15 years old. And so and like there was other 15-year-old teachers. Like I wasn't like the 15-year-old teacher, but nonetheless, this gave me an opportunity to really start my work with engaging with young people, and it kind of created like a unique dynamic in that I brought a level of skill that enabled me to support or to teach people that are like around the same age as me. Like typically when we're a dance teacher in like a dance studio, it's like we think of kids and things like that, but the students I was teaching, I think they were like two years younger than me, like some of them like maybe even within a year, And so I didn't really want to like engage them like as like a student and a teacher dynamic. It didn't feel right. Like I'm not an authoritative person in general. Quite permissive, and so excuse me. And so it didn't feel right to like do this dance move and you know what I mean? So anyway, so I kind of like developed this style of like kind of like not being abrasive, but kind of tried to lead by example. And I think that this particularly worked well in the scenario I was in because I was respected, right? Like my students, like they signed up for the dance studio, but they most often wanted to dance with me. I was very privileged in that a lot of the students that came to the dance studio to dance, like the ones who were interested in me teaching them, like there was a lot of them. Let me get away with being like more permissive and not having to like really put my foot down on things because they understood that I was they wanted to receive dance lessons from me, essentially. Like there was that value, they understood that. And so this is kind of when I got interested in working with humans, right? Like I just wanted to work with people. Like I don't necessarily consider myself like a people person, but I did enjoy supporting people in their journey of improvement, in this case being dance. And so anyway, so I got to this point where I didn't really know what I wanted to do with school, all this and that, whatever, but I wanted to help people. And I'd gone through this, like my personal experiences, and like went through a healing journey, and, kind of found myself empowered with the magic of working in a community through my dance lessons, which I taught for about 4 years. And so anyway, I got into social work. I went and did the social service worker program at Seneca, which is like a diploma version of the social work bachelor's degree in universities. It's effectively the same thing. They just pay you less. But anyway, I decided to do that, and I loved it, to be honest. Like it was like right up my alley. Like I fit right into the community whenever I started to work in the job. And it really and I should mention that this is what brought me to Toronto. So I went to Seneca, and where the place I was in my hometown didn't really have much of a connection to my culture. Of course, like my family, of course, is Indigenous, and like they don't hide it. Like they're very proud Indigenous people, but just like my family's just not like in touch with like ceremonies and things like that. Like they still participate like when the opportunity comes around, and like they're happy to be involved and express themselves culturally, but yeah, it just wasn't something that I was like so into, right? And so anyway, when I came to Toronto, started working at going to Seneca, I went into the First People's office, which is just like their Indigenous office. And shout out to Peggy Petawanakwit and Karen. I forget Karen's last name, but oh my gosh. But anyway, shout out to them. They do amazing work over there. And they got me involved in so many different things. They wanted the community to be they wanted all the students to be involved in the community, right? So that was really like my first like rich experience with my culture, and like being able to drive, like they would bring us out to the res and be able to meet with chiefs and learn about land settlements and all these things. And so anyway, so I'm doing my schooling, everything's cool, all this and that. And then I go into these two courses called, one was diversity and the other one was policy. And these two courses like particularly were inviting to me. I felt like I learned the most in those situations. And I feel like that's kind of where a lot of my focus was initially when I came into social work, because that's like the stuff that is online, right? Like the government of Canada and your local governments need to do news releases on things, right? And so I would hear about the policies and like try to connect them to my experience, etc. And so anyway, so I eventually became very interested in becoming a policy analyst and just generally working in policy. I felt like the work that I was doing as a social worker, which I did for 3.5 years, very challenged to overcome the very complex social challenges that are intersectional challenges that my program participants were experiencing. Like how could I, as someone who barely has a program budget, to support somebody with intersectional needs and housing being one of the main ones? You know what I mean? Like it's nothing I could have possibly done in those situations. Well, not nothing there, but you get what I mean. And so when I moved away from social work and got into policy, I realized that my role as a policy analyst was to educate decision makers with what reconciliation means to particular demographics or communities, right? So in the video yesterday, we talked about the call to action number 66. And if we look at it, I mean, it's quite a broad stroke thing. I'm totally prepared. Oh, okay, here it is. We call upon the federal government to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices. Like, that's pretty loaded, like multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations. You know what I mean? Like multi-year funding meaning what, right? You know what I mean? Like these are very large. And so the point I'm trying to make is that even politicians don't quite know how they're going to action those things, right? Like this is now a mandate given to people, and they have to follow through on it, right? They meaning like whoever's coming into office, all these things. And so having these commitments, but then not having a clear vehicle to action on them, that's kind of where a lot of the role of an Indigenous policy analyst comes in that they can work with people in the community, aka nonprofit organizations, whether they, no matter the service that they're offering, and put that into like government discourse, right? Like their kind of language, and say like, look, there's this amazing program that these folks want to do in the community, and you have these public commitments to reconciliation. This program addresses call to action 1, 5, 8, whatever. And then the politicians are like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Like, let's do that. You know what I mean? And then they credit for like, we're actioning on reconciliation, even though like they just gave a community organization the money to actually do all the work, right? And so I'm going to act like I didn't just lose 10 minutes of recording because my file filled up. And so my goal with Frayed Feathers is to be that vehicle for reconciliation. I've developed a process that is a mixture of facilitation and consultation, and really it's to extrapolate and strategize with a group, like no matter what the scale or context, whether they be corporate, small business, nonprofit, school, hospital, correctional facility, and connect what they're good at with reconciliation. And so we're going to get into a little bit more about that in the at the end of this video, or the end of this podcast. But it's really about actioning on that commitment as a Canadian citizen to reconciliation, right? Like we often hear this, it's up to all of us, but like a lot of us, all us meaning like the general populace, I feel like it's often the conception is that reconciliation is something for the federal government, or just governments, I guess, and the nonprofit or the public sector to address. But I say nay, to be honest. I think that it's up to all of us, and I think that the more commitment and engagement we can get from a variety of sectors, the more successful and quickly will reconciliation be met. And so I want to use my expertise in interpersonal communication, in community work, and my policy analysts, and being a policy analyst, to work with groups to strategize what they want to do, but then also offer that expertise of like, this might not land in community in the way you suspect, like you're like, this is a gap, and et cetera, and really kind of offer that education before things get out into the community, and then people are upset because finally they have a response that serves one of their needs, and it doesn't hit the mark, and it's just super frustrating, and people just want to heal, so Frayed Feathers is that glue, I guess, in between the high-level ideas of reconciliation and the practicality of services and human interaction, I guess, right? So we're going to jump into the next section of this podcast, which is going to be focused on the video itself, kind of like the value of these videos, and my mentality going into them, formulating them, etc. And so I think going into it, the reason why I'm approaching this challenge as like an educational thing and making videos is that, firstly, like, I don't know if I'm comfortable in front of a camera, but I'm like comfortable talking in front of people. So that's number one. That's a big asset. But then secondly, as a policy analyst, I feel like one of the things that you're doing when you present to people, especially that people who are not other policy analysts, you want to tell them the exact things that they need to know, right? So in nonprofit, like, I could sit here and like rhyme off all these stats about poor social outcomes for people that are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity or intersectional challenges of homelessness and substance use and head injury and all these things. But if you're listening, if you showed up to my presentation, you probably already accept that we should do something about it. You know what I mean? Like you're already committed to the community and things, and like me explaining to you how bad it is not going to change the way you think. You're like, okay, I guess it's worse than I thought. You know what I mean? And so I feel like my skill as a policy analyst and presenting is to offer folks who are not engaged in these things the exact information that they need to walk away as with something tangible and valuable to like that's empowered them, right? And so yeah, so it's just like, it's meant to be very value driven. I want the videos to be comprehensible by anybody, and yeah, and it's really just about bringing information in a way that is digestible and empowering for the viewer. And I think when I initially looked at like the landscape of reconciliation videos on YouTube and stuff, and I think that there's like, first of all, it's very limited, but second of all is that it's actually like a lot of really, really good stuff on there. But the challenge is that most of the stuff does one thing in particular very well. And then the rest of it just kind of falls short. And what I mean by that is, like, sometimes the video is long and has so much information condensed into it. So it's like you could tell the video creator like put a lot of love into the research, but it's structured in a way that I can't, even as someone who's engaged on these topics, I can't quite like digest and comprehend everything that's being said, you know? And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, there's more videos that are beautifully edited. The presenters speak super clearly. The script is well done, but it's short and offers really basic information. And I think that most of it surrounds the residential schools, the Sixties Scoop, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so my goal with Frayed Feathers and the channel here is to provide those same details, but in a way that is funneling people, or I don't want to say funneling people, but like building, illustrating how it all relates to Indigenous youth, right? So right now it's like very focused on like reconciliation in general, you know, and like what that means. And did my camera just move? Anyway, I'm not going to worry about it. And so, yeah, so they have these, oh, fuck, I don't even know what I just said. Lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, okay. And so these videos, like there is a lot of value in them, but you kind of need to like be able to fill the gaps, I guess. And so it really kind of goes to show like Indigenous youth are challenged to engage with a system that doesn't empower them to engage with it. You know what I mean? Like we're not learning about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in schools and how to engage with them, or like how to break down reconciliation into practical, actionable steps by anybody. You know what I mean? And so like you go online and like it's just people like me who are hopefully explaining it to you in a way that you understand, and like it's becomes valuable for you, right? And so and I think that this premise that I just explained is like a symptom of youth in general just not being a priority for politicians. And I don't mean as in like they don't like youth or like they have a mandate against them or anything like that. It's just more or less like as a politician, you can only have so many priorities. Like as a politician, like you were likely focused on like one or two very specific mandates, right? Like I'm the climate resilience person, you know, I mean, I'm the fisheries person, and I'm the whatever, right? And so I think, you know, even bigger challenge is that like youth don't vote, right? Like they're not a very strongly represented demographic within the voting system. And so there's these politicians, like why would a politician be like, I'm here for the youth, you know what I mean, when like nobody shows up to vote for them, right? Like it becomes this like conversation, or this much bigger challenge of like, you know, if we want youth services and like youth reconciliation, we also need to empower youth to vote and things like this, right? Engage at that political level so it makes its way down, you know. Like we see all throughout history so many historical events where a community of people is disenfranchised by legislation that doesn't recognize them, right? Or you know, won't get into all that, but yeah, you get the point. And so and then anyway, and so I think the how like the next point into this, and so the next part into this is that as somebody just in the community, as an Indigenous youth just in the community, right? Like you're probably, if you're engaged on reconciliation, you know, your friends are probably, you know, a bunch of advocates, you know, they're engaged on these different things, and they understand the need and magic for community work and all these things. But you can even see it in like people's bio. When I say like you, I mean like I've seen it in people's bio, you know what I mean? It's like advocacy and being having like being value driven in the context of like social challenges is like become like its own culture. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I'm an advocate. I want reconciliation and women's rights and LGBTQIA plus rights, and we want the water back, land back, you know, all these different things, right? And it becomes just like, I'm just an advocate. I'm somebody who advocates for, you know, the government to be nicer to people, you know what I mean? And then they just list all these different things that like advocates are for. But like politicians are smart. They don't do that for a reason, because you literally couldn't focus on all these things. Like no matter, like even me, it's like, you know, it's so easy for somebody to be like, oh, Indigenous youth, well, why don't you focus on Indigenous seniors? Like they need help too. It's like, bro, like I'm one person. Like I can't do it all. You know what I mean? And so anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that even if you're an Indigenous youth in the community, you want to know about reconciliation, it's really hard to not be led astray by some of these discussions of reconciliation that are happening like over Instagram and stuff like that. And, you know, people always posting about like people's opinions on reconciliation. And so you can kind of get this, you're kind of learning about reconciliation through the lens of somebody else and how they understand reconciliation, right? And so where I feel like I bring value into this sector is that my content, my videos, not so much my podcasts, you know, we kind of talk a little shit around here. My videos are just about the core content of reconciliation, like no BS. You can find everything I'm saying online in the description. Like I've always put the sources. You can review these things. If I get it wrong, you can call me out on it. It's not just me talking in an interview format, posting it online, and then somebody reposting and being like, wow, this is truth. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of context that goes into this, and there's a lot of different strategies within the community of reconciliation advocates to go about this work. You know, some people are very angry and they reject the system. You know, they don't want to engage with the government. They want treaty negotiations to go through, right? Like they don't want to have to engage with a political system that doesn't recognize their political system, right? And so it's like complete rejection. And then there's other people where I'd say where I kind of fit more into, but more or less I just kind of fell into this role, where it's like we're in the system. You know, I am an urban Indigenous person. I operate out of an urban Indigenous organization. You know, I am not from the res, although I have status, you know what I mean? Like, and so anyway, we engage with the system in order to change the system, right? And so there's these two major demographics, two opposite ends of the spectrum, but then there's everybody in the middle, right? And so like you're, as a person just consuming reconciliation content, you're like, you have no idea where you're going to end up on this spectrum. Like how you're like what's the lens you're learning it from, right? And so my goal is just to bring the grounded information, you know, like anybody can watch my information and they'll agree, because it's just research based. It's not meant to offer it's not meant to offer my opinion, you know, although I do try to offer stories to connect the things that are happening in history to more modern Indigenous experience, right? And so yeah, so that's my goal with the content. I want to bring the core content of reconciliation, and then conversations can kind of build themselves out from that. And that brings us to the third section of this podcast, where I talk about the things that didn't make it into the video. Excuse me. So something that I was really going back and forth on was talking about the Sixties Scoop. Now, the Sixties Scoop is a separate occurrence from residential schools, although it did happen within that timeline. This timeline's like 1831 to 1996, I believe. Of course, I've put my papers away. I just want to make sure I get this right, because I just talked about how I get things right. Yeah, 1831 to 1996. So, obviously, 60s Scoop happened within the 60s, 1960s. And Yeah, some of these youth definitely went to residential schools, but it was predominantly about Indigenous youth being apprehended from Indigenous families and then put into European-centric families, you know. But they went all around the world, even all the way to like Australia or something like that, I think, as well. And so, anyway, I didn't want to make the video confusing. As in, I want to stick to like one topic, one video, right? And so the 60s Scoop, in my opinion, like deserves its own video. It being more close to the present time, like in the 1960s, and like still having lasting effects today. Not to say residential schools don't, but like it's just like it hits harder because people are like, oh, 1960s, yeah, you know, my mother's from that time era, you know what I mean? But then you say 1831 and people are like, oh, it's in the past, when they don't realize that 1996 was a year before I was born, you know what I mean? Like, and so anyway, the point is that it deserves its own video. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action, they include points or recommendations, or not recommendations, calls to action that champion the advocacy from the 60s Scoop, right? So like pretty much like a massive overhaul of the childcare system in Canada, right? Being very centered around apprehension of Indigenous communities or Indigenous kids, etc. Right? So there's like there's a lot of overlap, and without a doubt, like like residential schools and 60s Scoop have a lot of overlap, but it needs to be its own video, in my opinion, and that's like how I'll do it justice. And so that brings us to the very final section where I wrap this all up, and I really want to kind of talk about my goal with Frayed Feathers. So I've developed this process that is, I mentioned earlier, like it works with groups to action on reconciliation, but I think that there's also a level of understanding that needs to be met amongst people who are interested in reconciliation, that this is not something for the public sector and federal government to fix. It's actually a commitment that we all have as Canadian citizens. You know, like, you know, I just, like, for full transparency, like my family's not all Indigenous. Like, my mother's French Canadian, you know, and so like it's not just because I'm Indigenous that I'm telling you need to do these things. Like, this is just the reality that we live in, you know what I mean? Like, it's not the general public's fault that colonization happened the way it did, but it is the public's responsibility to ensure that it doesn't happen again, and we do that by reconciling and making it better, right? And so I think it's one of those topics that a lot of people want to engage on, but they don't necessarily know how to move forward on it, right? Like, you know, and it's also like analysis by paralysis. Like, if the worst thing that you could do to a vulnerable population is do something that is counterproductive to helping them, right? Like, it's like throwing salt in the wound, you know? And so I think that that's where most of the people who are enthusiastic about reconciliation kind of end, right? Like, oh, we want to do something, you know, we see the clear need to support the Indigenous youngins in our community, but the last thing they want to do is sour relationships and make everything worse, right? And so I feel like Frayed Feathers can offer that vehicle to like bridge that gap in between these high-level aspirations and working with community to develop a actionable strategy to bring reconciliation to young Indigenous people. And now, when we consider who would this process be for, corporates, nonprofits, small businesses, schools, correctional facilities, hospitals, insurance companies, driving insurance, or not driving insurance, driving academies, you know, every single ministry in the government, you know, all these people, all these stakeholders, they have expertise, right? Like whether you know how to operate heavy equipment or manage projects, you have skills that can address some of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so I work with people and so some of the examples of what these things might be, I mean, in the case of nonprofit, it's quite clear, right? Like we want to offer a supportive service to people, it's going to do all these things to support their needs, and then it's going to lead to positive social outcomes in the community, right? But then we also have very high level technical things about money. You know what I mean? Like in order to reach reconciliation, there is a massive amount of mentoring that needs to happen with Indigenous communities and leaders in order to take on the responsibilities that would come along with reconciliation. Like, so for example, like we all think land back, right? Like give the land back to Indigenous people. This is their land when they first came here, or when they were here and there were settlers, right? Well, land is very expensive and land is hard to manage, and you can't just give somebody billions and billions of dollars worth of something and not teach them how to manage it. You know what I mean? And this is not about saying that Indigenous people aren't capable, but if you were forced to survive for the first 20 years of your life, and then you turn 21 and they're like, here's $1 billion. Like, dude, you don't know how to manage that money. And people are forced to survive and live in that survival state because of colonization, right? And so it's like it's so easy to look at Indigenous people and like, oh, you have no capacity, you can't do all these things. Meanwhile, like they were completely disenfranchised to doing those things, and those people were very successful at their jobs, right? And so anyway, when it comes to Indigenous youth, it's all about offering your expertise to those Indigenous youth, right? And so my work working in social work and being a policy analyst is I can take your high-level ideas and work them into measurable steps for you to work with Indigenous youth in your community, and then you can connect those things to to the calls to action to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and be able to demonstrate your commitment to reconciliation, right? So I've thrown a lot at you during this podcast, and thank you for making this far. Holy smokes, like it's only my second video. But I want to end this with just talking about what's kind of coming down the pipe and what my vision is for the next few videos. So my goal with this series is to outline all the developments of implementation in the implementation of call to action number 66. So number 66 being the one specifically about youth, establishing the multi-year funding and network of best practices, etc. I want to talk about a report that I mentioned in the previous video by, Andre Baer, Gabrielle Fayant, and Matali Okalik. These three youth advisors had developed a report that would inform the pilot project that was developed in 2019. And so we're going to unpack that report, and it's going to set us up for the video after that, which is talking about that pilot project, which is now in its last year of implementation. And then once we reach the present time of like where that pilot project is, we're going to go into Indigenous youth roots, which is like the actual like thing that they made through this pilot, and talk about how Indigenous youth can benefit from it. And like its structure and all these different things. And then once we kind of lay down that foundation, we're going to bring it into we're going to kind of like dial in a little bit more and get more specific about the things that have happened that are outside of call to action number 66, but are still related to Indigenous youth. So that's where we'll get into a lot of the childcare system, and I'm going to bring those contexts into a more British Columbia-centered context eventually. But I think it's really important that I outline all the things that are happening at the federal government, because those things go into the provincial government, and then that even has further complexities when it goes into municipalities, right? And so I want to bring it from the top and then slowly work the way down, and then eventually we'll get to this point where kind of everything's been covered. And if anybody wants to know anything about Indigenous youth reconciliation, they can go to Frayed Feathers. There'll be a video on pretty much everything that they would want to know about, plus these podcasts that are just talking about the overall kind of things, the intangibles and all that. And I would eventually like to get to a point where I'm able to interview and work with community organizations, just people in the community to really kind of even further those learnings, right? And so I want Frayed Feathers channel on YouTube to just be a wealth of experience and knowledge for people to go to consult about Indigenous youth reconciliation. They can send their youth advisories there and all these different things. And I'm going to be super accessible. I'm in the middle of developing a Discord channel at the moment. That Discord channel is going to have a lot of my work, kind of a little bit of a hub for the things that I do, but it's also going to have some exclusive resources, right? Like things that maybe I'll develop a one pager for a video, or all the instead of just getting the links to all the sources that I used, or the citations to the sources, maybe I'll be thrown in one pages of all the raw data or something like that, right? And then so people can just go into there and they could just benefit from the high level data written out in the Discord, but then also just consume the content through the video if they wanted to, right? And so making it accessible to all people is my goal. And so thanks for listening. Holy smokes, you've donated so much time to me today, and I couldn't be more grateful. And miigwech, I'll catch you later. And as a parting gift, and this is my parting gift to you. Say goodbye, Saint. He's shy. Bye.